Hello, I'm Hugh Ross, and welcome to Stars, Cells, and God. Today we'll be exploring some of the exciting concepts and topics in my new book, Designed to the Core. Designed to the Core is a culmination of decades worth of research and breakthroughs in science. I couldn't be more enthusiastic about the work we have completed. My latest book is set to release widely in September 2022. However, today I am privileged to share with you that for partners of our ministry, you'll be able to receive early access to this amazing resource before that launch date. To receive early access to this book, all you have to do is visit reasons.org/donate and make a donation of any amount to our ministry. Then in early August, maybe even earlier, you'll receive a copy of my newest book, Designed to the Core. For those of you who already support our ministry regularly, you can expect to receive the book in early August as well. I could not be more pleased to share this resource with you, and I hope it inspires you to share your faith with others. For more information, please visit reasons.org. Again, you can get the book at reasons.org/donation. But before I talk about an amazing discovery that ties into Design to the Core, Fuzz, you got a discovery you want to talk about. Let's launch with that.
Sure thing, Hugh. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Beginning to make its way to the light of day. It's always a fun thing as an author to see your book become a reality. So congratulations. You know, I'm going to be talking about a discovery that has implications for the origin of life question. And I think, many people are interested in the question, how does life originate here on Earth? How do the very first cells appear on Earth? And what were the events that led to the origin of life? And this is not only a question really of scientific interest, it's actually a big question in the sense that it has philosophical and theological ramifications. Did life originate through unguided, undirected processes? Was it the work of a creator? But also, it has implications for how we think about ourselves as human beings and what is our place in the cosmos. And in fact, when I began to study the origin of life question as a graduate student 35 plus years ago, that investigation convinced me that there had to be a creator, that there was no way that chemistry and physics could generate the very first cells, that there had to be a mind behind everything.
And I'm guessing you're even more convinced as a result of this new discovery, right?
Yes. Well, the contravening 35 years has really only demonstrated more and more intractable problems with chemical evolutionary scenarios for the origin of life. Yet, from a scientific perspective, most investigators are pursuing chemical evolution as the means to explain the origin of life. They're approaching it from a materialistic, natural process standpoint. And every step in the process of the origin of life is replete with what I would deem, and I think you would deem, intractable problems, including how do you explain the origin of prebiotic materials and the building blocks for life. And so there's a number of ideas that have been proposed. Stanley Miller's original ideas were that, these gaseous molecules in the atmosphere could react under high energy conditions and produce prebiotic materials that would accumulate in the Earth's oceans, and then undergo chemical complexification to generate building block materials. That idea is largely being abandoned for the most part by origin of life researchers. Some people have suggested maybe, volcanic emissions on the early Earth could have created a milieu where prebiotic materials could have formed. There's, significant problems with that approach. Some have suggested hydrothermal vents. That doesn't work for a variety of reasons that you and I detail in both the book, Origins of Life, and then in Creating Life in the Lab, I revisit some of those issues.
And just to be clear, we're talking about the building blocks of life molecules.
Yes.
We're not talking proteins, DNA, and RNA. We're just talking about what composes those.
Exactly. Yeah. The small organic molecules that could then in turn react to form things like amino acids and nucleobases and fatty acids and sugars. So that's what we're talking about here. And so, one of the ways that people are exploring accounting for the building block materials for life is through extraterrestrial delivery. Early in the Earth's history, there were a high frequency of impactors striking the Earth, asteroids, comets. There was an influx of interplanetary dust particles. So part of the argument is, well, maybe these delivery mechanisms were not only delivering, or these impact events were maybe delivering organic materials to the early Earth. And part of the motivation for thinking that that's a possibility is the discovery of carbonaceous chondrite meteorites and analysis that has been done on, the organic extracts from those meteorites. They typically run about 20% carbonaceous material. Is that right?
That's true. And they've discovered well over 100 carbonaceous molecules in them.
Yes. And in fact, great that you brought that point up, because here's what's called a chromatogram of a typical chromatogram that you would see in terms of the total organic extracts from a carbonaceous chondrite. I think this was from Murchison. And this is a chromatogram where each peak approximately represents a single molecule. It's much more complicated than that. And of course, you see a lot of noise, or what appears to be noise, which are actually microscopic or very small peaks, indicating a trace amount of certain materials.
And Murchison is the biggest of the carbonaceous molecules that have ever been recovered.
Yes, and so this is indicating that there is a rich abundance of organic materials, and people have discovered 96 amino acids, by the way, in Murchison. Not all of them, of course, are biologically relevant. They have also recovered 6 purines. And purines are a class of chemical compounds that include 2 of the components of DNA, adenine and guanine. And so this is
We're talking nucleobases here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is not the entire nucleotide. These
if
are
I
just.
remember right, too, they found 6, maybe 7 of the bioactive amino acids.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head what the number of amino acids that have been discovered that are biologically relevant.
I know they found 6, and I know they have not found more than 7. I think there's the 7th one, there's debate over.
Yeah.
But it still means a majority are missing.
Yeah, that's probably right. I mean, there's organic chemists know of well over 500 amino acids.
Right.
And so,
But they have found the simplest of the bioactive amino acids.
Yeah. Right, glycine, alanine,
right.
Things like that. But here in this diagram, it shows the 5 nucleobases that are found in DNA and RNA. A, G, C, and T, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine are found in DNA, whereas in RNA, uracil replaces thymine. But only 2 of those have been discovered up to this point in carbonaceous chondrites. That would be adenine and guanine. And this, of course, is really interesting because if you're going to build DNA, you need to have these nucleobases. These nucleobases are part of the building blocks for DNA and RNA, which are called nucleotides or ribonucleotides for RNA, and deoxyribonucleotides for DNA. And it's these ribonucleotides or deoxyribonucleotides in DNA linked together kind of in a head-to-tail manner to form 2 strands that align a line to produce a ladder architecture. That if you twist that ladder, you get the well-known DNA double helix. But if you look on the right of this diagram, it gives you the molecular details where the backbone is consisting of alternating deoxyribose and phosphate subunits, and attached to the deoxyribose in the one position are one of the nucleobases.
This is a nice diagram, Fuzz, because it really shows you how they link together.
Yes. Yeah, it's an exceptional diagram. But again, so what we're looking at with these nucleobases is not a nucleotide, but really one of the components that make up a nucleotide that's necessary to build DNA. And again, as we mentioned, only these 2 have been discovered up to this point in the carbonaceous chondrites. And this is where the paper that I want to talk about comes into play. This is work published in Nature communications by a team from Japan that have identified pyrimidines in these carbonaceous chondrites. So they've identified uracil and cytosine.
Interesting. The paper says wide diversity, and we're talking two.
Yeah, well, there's a wide diversity of nucleobases, but not of the purines
Of the bioactive ones, you need.
Yeah, I mean, they discovered a few others that are non-biologically significant, but to say it's a wide diversity, I think, is a bit of an overstatement.
Bit of a stretch.
Yeah, but what they did in this particular study is they developed really state-of-the-art analytical methods, where they developed an extraction technique that was specifically designed to target nucleobases, and they were using analytical instrumentation that allowed them part per trillion detection.
Wow.
Right. And so, in the early studies of the Murchison meteorite, analytically, I think it was part per million.
That's right, part per million.
And then the techniques have improved to part per billion. And so now they're really have a juiced up analytical system that can go part per trillion.
Factor of a million improvement. That's incredible.
Yeah. Well, this is an exceptional paper from an analytical chemistry standpoint. And what they ended up doing is studying 3 separate carbonaceous chondrites. These are very familiar meteorites to many people. On the left is the Murray, which fell in 1950 in Kentucky, I think. The middle is the Murchison, or a piece of the Murchison that fell in Australia in 1969. And then on the right is the Tagish, or the Lake Tagish meteorite. I can't remember. I remember when it fell, but I can't remember the year. Now, it was in the early 2000s. Do you remember the precise year?
I don't remember the precise year, but it fell in a frozen Canadian lake. And it has a distinction of being the most quickly recovered.
Right.
So it's the least contaminated of the meteorite falls.
And that actually is really very important, because there's always concern when you do a chemical analysis of extracts from these meteorites that you're not actually picking up contaminants from the environment. Right, and or that these contaminants haven't infused the meteorite. And so the research team was well aware of this concern, and so they had not only samples of the meteorites, but also samples of the soil that was adjacent, at least to the Murchison and the Murray, and they were able to show that the nucleobases that they extracted actually had a different profile than what you saw in the soil samples. And in fact, they saw nucleobases in the meteorites that weren't present in the soil samples. They also looked at the racemization of alanine, or they looked at the chirality of the alanine recovered, and they saw it was a racemic mixture, which suggests it's not contamination. There was another interesting study they did as part of this, where they had apparently 2 pieces of the Murchison that were different masses, and apparently the sense is that if you're dealing with terrestrial contamination, then the amount of the concentration of recovered nucleobases should actually be proportional to the size of the meteorite fragment. And they didn't see that relationship. They saw it as being the concentration independent of fragment size. So those 3 things suggested to them that they probably were dealing with indigenous materials, not contamination.
Well, let me bring up another issue. If it's not contamination, I would expect that the Tagish Lake meteorite would have the same amount that you would get in the Murray and the Murchison. Was that the case? Or
well, I mean, no, I mean the diversity of the Lake Tagish meteorite was less than the Murchison in the Murray, and the levels were much lower.
That's a concern for me, because I would expect if it's not contamination, all 3 would be the same.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Something else that they didn't do that I would have expected that they would do, because they were using mass spectrometry as part of the analytical methodology, was to look for the carbon-13 and deuterium enrichment, because extraterrestrial organics are enriched in those 2 isotopes.
Right.
They should have been able to do that in their experiment. They didn't report any results. That would have been, I think, something else that would have been worthwhile to have. But I mean, I think they went through reasonable efforts to say that what they're dealing with is largely indigenous. But again, you can never fully rule out contamination being.
Well, especially with Tagish Lake having lower abundance levels.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a concern for me.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. So anyway, through this analysis, they discovered that in the Murchison, about 150 parts per billion of adenine, and then the levels fell off, not dramatically, but with guanine and other non-biological purines. And they detected on the order of about a part 1 to 2 parts per billion of the pyrimidine.
Mm-hmm.
When they went to the Murray meteorite, they were seeing about 50 or so parts per billion of adenine, and again about 1 to 2 parts per billion of the pyrimidines, including uracil and cytosine. And then with the Lake Tagish, they were only seeing about 10 parts per billion of the adenine, and again, trace amounts of the pyrimidines. And the number of species they saw in the Lake Tagish was lower. So, this is all, but the way this result has been interpreted is, oh, look, extraterrestrial delivery could produce provide us, with the
building blocks.
With the building blocks that we would need for DNA, the nucleobases we would need for DNA. And again, as we're discussing, contamination is always something that is of concern, but it's remarkable to me how low the levels are. So if indeed this was a source of prebiotic materials for the origin of life, it's not a lot of material that's being delivered when you're talking about stuff on the order of part per billion, because remember, these meteorites and other extraterrestrial sources, when they hit the Earth, it's going to be a dilution effect where the surface volume of the Earth now is going to dramatically lower the effective concentration,
right,
quite substantially. So yes, maybe indeed some of these materials are delivered to the early Earth, but that the inventory that's delivered is going to be inconsequential, I would argue, to the origin of life.
Right.
And it's interesting that when we look at the carbonaceous deposits on the early Earth, we don't see a carbon 13 or deuterium enrichment in those deposits, which would suggest that that a significant fraction was coming from extraterrestrial delivery. Instead, we see carbon 12 enrichment, which suggests that these carbonaceous materials in the oldest rocks on Earth are actually biological in origin.
They're the decay products of a living material.
Right. Another problem is chemical selectivity. And so this is an example of the types of things that have been found in things like the Murchison. And the point here is that, you're dealing with, again, a diversity of materials. And so even if you are, delivering extraterrestrial materials, it's the materials that you're looking for are going to be swamped out.
They're being diluted
by other quote unquote nucleobase type materials. So I mean, this is a scientific milestone, and indeed they discovered evidence for pyrimidines in these meteorites. So this is a first ever type of discovery. But I think to claim that this is somehow providing us with any kind of insight into the source of prebiotic materials and the building block materials for life, I think is really a stretch. And so this doesn't solve the problem of where do life's building block materials come from in an origin of life scenario.
Well, they found just 2 of the 5 nucleobases, so there's 3 missing, and the 2 they did find and the Tagish Lake thing are extremely low abundance levels.
Right.
And even with Tagish Lake, you got the possibility of contamination.
Right. I mean, another way you could explain the difference in diversity and concentrations may be to say that these materials were forming in the meteorites, after the meteorites formed in the solar system. So in other words, that these are not necessarily ancient organic materials that go back to 4.5 billion years ago, but they may be materials that formed in situ in the extra, or sorry, in the in the material, in the material that constitutes the meteorites, before it struck the Earth, which then would give some, credibility to the idea that maybe some of these lab experiments that people have done are identifying chemical pathways that could, in principle, generate, organic materials that would be interesting to the origin of life if you assume the meteorites become kind of a proxy for the early Earth. But then again, you're still dealing with the issue of very low levels and the selectivity problem. And so maybe some of these chemical reactions in the lab that have been discovered may have contributed to the formation of these materials on the early Earth, but the productivity would have been insufficient, to really be relevant to the origin of life. So anyway, this, doesn't move anybody any closer to really understanding the origin of life through materialistic means. But it is interesting that I see more and more origin of life researchers appealing to extraterrestrial delivery as the means to explain where prebiotics come from. And in fact, just as I was preparing for this recording, this news item was published just a day or two ago, where a team from Japan, I guess, sent a probe to an asteroid,
Right.
and then were able to collect samples and return them to the Earth, which is amazing. That's an amazing technological feat. And they discovered amino acids apparently in these asteroid samples. There's no scientific paper that I can find that's connected to this news item. It could just simply be a press release well ahead of the actual scientific paper, just to generate some excitement as a preliminary result. But this is going to be, again, something that's not going to go away, because already the claim here is that, again, asteroid delivery could have contributed to the origin of life.
Well, Fuzz is an astronomer. I say, okay, what's the origin of these meteorites and asteroids? Fundamentally, it's interstellar molecular clouds. And likewise, astronomers have been using their spectrographs to detect carbonaceous molecules. They've now found over 140 of them, but they've yet to find an amino acid or a nucleobase or any of the complex sugars. Right. However, they're only able to detect them right now 1 part per billion. And so I do agree with you that if you're dealing with meteorites and asteroids, we would expect a slightly higher concentration.
Yeah.
But there should be a relationship that you can calculate between what you detect in interstellar molecular cloud and what you expect in a meteorite. And I've read some papers where they say, well, maybe the meteorite coming through Earth's atmosphere generates some chemistry that concentrates it, or the meteorite winds up shedding material that would actually give you a higher concentration because you're getting rid of stuff that's not carbonaceous. But there should be a relationship. And so until we find these molecules in interstellar molecular clouds, then I don't, and again, I think that sustains. We're looking at really low abundance levels. The Tagish Lake meteorite is way more abundant than what we see in interstellar molecular clouds. So perhaps there's some contamination going on there, or something's happening where the meteorite is being ablated as it goes through the atmosphere, getting rid of stuff that's not carbonaceous, and that would explain the higher concentration. So I think this is a fertile area for biochemists, for geologists and astronomers to work together to say, let's see if we can really figure out what's going on. But the bottom line is, this is not good news for the naturalists.
No, it's not. It's yeah. And again, it's fascinating to speculate on what the chemistry is that's producing these materials. And it's very clear that organic chemistry happens.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it likely would have happened on the early Earth as well. But again, the question is it productive enough? Because either that, or you've got to explain some kind of concentration mechanism on the Earth itself to produce effective, high enough concentrations of these materials to affect, sufficient chemical processes.
Well, that's where I think the meteorites are significant, because you actually got a concentration mechanism going on with meteorites compared to interstellar molecular clouds. But once these things land on the Earth, is there any other mechanism that could significantly concentrate? And as I read the scientific literature, the answer is no.
Yeah. Okay, so that's what I've got for us. So
okay, well, let me see if I can get my slides up for this is just an image of our star, the sun, showing a really big flare coming off the sun, because what I'm going to be talking about is flares. All stars have flares, but there's two papers I want to discuss here that talk about just how extraordinary our star, the sun, is. There is no other star like the sun. And so this first paper here is Extreme Energetic Particle Events by Superflare Associated from solar-like stars. And in an earlier paper, the sun is less active than other solar-like stars. And so here shows a really big flare coming off the sun. And then what these two papers do is they basically took a particle acceleration and transport model. It's a computer model, and it was done in 2 dimensions. The older models were done in 1 dimension. It's a 2-dimensional model. And then they combined that with a survey, what they call young solar analog stars. Stars that are the mass of the sun, have the same composition of the sun, the same age of the sun, or same characteristics. But they looked at the young ones. And so basically they're trying to get an idea, what was the sun like when it was young? And what they discovered in the survey is that these young solar-like stars have really strong surface magnetic fields. So our star, the sun, is like about 1 Gauss if you average it over the whole surface. What you see with these young solar-type stars, it's 100 to 400 Gauss. So strong magnetic fields and large star spots. I mean, I've been looking at the sun through my telescope since I was a teenager, and probably the most significant coverage I saw was a little bit less than 1% of the surface of the sun. But when you see these young solars, it's between 5 and 10% of the surface of the star is covered by these huge star spots.
So what is a star spot precisely?
Well, a star spot is a local area on the surface of the star where you got a much higher magnetic field than what's normative for the rest of the surface. And because of that high magnetic field, that means you get a dark spot, because instead of just the heat of the star coming off, you got heat energy and magnetic energy. And so the fact that you've got to split the total energy in that region between heat and magnetism means you get a colder spot than you would in an area where you don't have a strong magnetic field.
I see.
So that's what a sunspot is. A sunspot is a place where you got local strong magnetic fields, and therefore the radiation coming up in that area is less, well, the light radiation is less than the radiation you get from other parts of the star. So that's all you need to know about star spots. But star spots, because of the strong local magnetic fields, that's a place where the flares take place. It generates particle radiation. You get a strong wind coming up from the star. And so, and it's the particle radiation that poses a problem for life. But what's interesting about the paper is they said it not only poses a problem for life, it poses a problem for the origin of life. We were just talking about the origin of life. So I'm glad our 2 discoveries kind of linked together. But they're basically pointing out, hey, based on these young solar analogs, we know that the origin of life dates back at least 3.8 billion years ago on the Earth. That takes us far enough back in the history of the solar system that we're going to have these strong flare events and particle radiation bursts that are going to pose a problem. And so, you've got this prebiotic chemistry going on the Earth, but at the same time, it's being bombarded by the solar radiation, these frequent superflares. And that's going to, basically upset any possibility for the origin of life from a naturalistic perspective. So we're just talking about how it's getting more and more intractable for the naturalists to explain the origin of life. Well, this paper basically adds one more intractable problem, and that is, hey, the early sun is going to be pouring out a lot more superflares at a much higher rate and a much greater intensity than it does today. And then it's going to have implications for the chemistry of the atmosphere, which is going to pose another problem. You're talking about the delivery of meteorites. Well, if they're going through an atmosphere that's chemistry is being disturbed by these solar events, That means that this speculation about the delivery of viable prebiotic molecules, we now got another problem.
Yeah.
The solar radiation is going to be breaking up that chemistry. So, but the sun presently is at its lowest flaring activity level. All stars have flares, but the flaring activity depends on the age of the star. And so what this study was showing, the surveys, young solar-like stars are going to have thousands of times, 10,000s of times more flaring activity than middle-aged stars. It's also true that as our star gets older, it's going to become more active in terms of its flaring. One of the jokes I tell Fuzz is that stars are like humans. They're unstable when they're young, they're unstable when they're old. But where the analogy breaks down, humans are stable for most of their lifespan. That's not true with stars. Stars are unstable for most of their lifespan. The window of time when they're stable enough for life is very narrow in the history. And I think I've got a little graph here that basically shows you this. That green dotted line you see over towards the left, that's kind of the region where they did the young solar analog studies.
Okay.
And then that blue dotted line is where we are right now. So it basically shows you that presently we're at the very bottom minimum for flaring activity. And isn't it great that our Creator chose to create us when the flaring activity was at the minimum? And this doesn't really show you the drama of what was published in these papers, because the vertical axis you see there, it's logarithmic. And so where you see that green dotted line, you have about 10,000 times more flaring activity than what we have today. And at the top there, it's 100,000 times more. So basically showing, hey, there was a superflare back in 1859, and it basically shut down the telegraph systems around the world. If that were to happen today, it would knock out almost all the world's power grids, which would be a huge catastrophe. But fortunately, that's a relatively minor flare event. But if you go back to the origin of life, we're talking intensities that are tens of thousands of times greater. And so this is a new challenge to origin of life from a naturalistic perspective, just recognizing that it's not the chemistry that we would anticipate on the surface of the Earth today. We got a completely different environment. Because I see a lot of and we've dealt with this in our book, Origins of Life, the assumption that conditions were benign on the surface of the Earth for prebiotic chemistry, and at least no worse than they are today. Well, this is evidence, hey, they're orders of magnitude worse than they are today.
Right.
And so it's a new thing that needs to be taken into account in the origin of life.
Now, I mean, it's interesting when you look at that graph, because if you go 500 million years back, you still are at a fairly low point in the flaring activity, and that's about when you see the Cambrian explosion in the appearance of complex, animal life. And so these complex animal life forms are not going to be able to tolerate solar flaring any better than we are.
Well, the Cambrian explosion animals can handle a factor of 10 greater, which is about what you see there. It's about 10 times worse at the Cambrian explosion, beginning of the Cambrian explosion. But it explains why. Another reason why you only see bacteria previous to the Avalon and Cambrian explosions. The solar radiation is not going to permit life anymore, advance in microbial life or colonies of microbial life. But another reason, of course, is we need 3 billion years of bacterial activity to chemically transform the surface of the planet for plants and animals.
I mean, it's remarkable when you think about the fact that that chemical transformation creates an environment that makes the Cambrian explosion possible at the precise time where the solar flaring activity is.
Well, you've given me a new idea, Fuzz, because I've written an article about how the Cambrian explosion, the Avalon explosion, happens at the very first time that oxygen permits that life to exist. This adds another component. The Avalon explosion happens at the very first time that the radiation would permit that life to exist. And then with the Cambrian explosion,
Mm-hmm.
you got even more complex animals.
Right.
So that's something to follow up on. I'm going to actually dig into the literature and see if that could make a.
Yeah, and when would you start seeing like the continental shelf and the uh, kind of forming? Because I've also heard people argue that the Cambrian explosion is also happening at a time where
Well,
there's sufficient continents. You need continental land masses, ironically, in order to have actually animals in the Cambrian, because they have to have a shallow water environment or a
right,
relatively
right.
shallow water environment to live.
Well, you've probably heard of the Great Unconformity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a geological catastrophe that happened just before the Avalon explosion of life. And really, what it is a massive tectonic event that causes landslides off of the continents
Mm.
into the oceans. But that's what forms the continental shelves.
Ah.
And it's that continental shelf environment which was crucial to have the Avalon explosion and later the Cambrian explosion. So yeah, the geology factors into this as well. Moreover, it was that great unconformity, those massive line slides off the continents and the oceans that drove the deep oxygen cycle that
Mm.
caused the oxygen to jump from 1% up to 8%,
Yeah.
which is the minimum needed for Avalon life. So yeah, this is all beautifully connected. And by the way, this is all in the book Designed to the Core.
Okay. So
Yeah.
so people definitely want to get a copy of that book. It's fascinating to me just how everything.
Everything fits together.
The confluence of events is
right,
remarkable.
right. But I want to conclude this with one other thing that's also in Design to the Core, and that is that the sun has the lowest flaring activity of all known stars. So astronomers have not just surveyed young solar analogs, they have surveyed middle-aged solar
Mm.
analogs, stars that are the same age as the sun, the same mass as the sun, and are close to the same composition. But what they discovered is when we compare the sun's flaring activity to the stars that most closely match the sun is by far the lowest. All other stars that come closest to matching the
Mm.
sun's characteristics have significantly greater flaring activity. And then this paper I was referring to here, I mean, this is came out after Design to the Core, but it confirms what I wrote there. This article I did cite in Design to the Core, and it was a comparison of the luminosity stability of the most solar-like stars compared to the sun.
Mm.
And this is a figure you'll see in the book. So the top one shows you the luminosity variability of the sun, and the bottom one shows the star that places second to the sun.
Mm.
So that's the second best star we found out of the millions of stars
So
we
it's the
looked at.
same scale for both.
Same scale for both. So you can see that the lower image, you're getting significantly more, 5 times more luminosity and stability than you get for the sun. And the question is, well, if we were orbiting a star that comes second to the sun at luminosity stability, could we have global civilization? The answer is no.
Yeah.
That would be too unstable for us to have global civilization. We need to be orbiting a star, and the only star that we can find in our Milky Way galaxy that has an extremely low level of luminosity variability is our star, the sun. But yeah, you'll see this figure in Design to the Core.
So is there a fundamental understanding as to what contributes to flaring?
Right here.
Great.
Because I've got a couple of chapters in the book where I compare the planets orbiting our star, the sun, with the planets that are orbiting extrasolar planetary systems. And now we have found 5,000 planets orbiting stars outside of our solar system. When you look at what are called the rocky planets, these are the relatively small planets that are predominantly rock with a thin atmosphere around, relatively thin. What we're discovering is you've got the solar system, which only has cool Rockies. And that's defined as a rocky planet that orbits farther from its star than Mercury orbits the sun. Whereas when you look at exoplanetary systems, notice none of the rocky planets that they've discovered orbit their stars as distantly as Mercury. Matter of fact, most of them are orbiting less than 10% of the distance between the sun and the Earth. So 4 times closer to their host stars than Mercury orbits. And then you got what are called the warm Rockies, which is between 10% and the orbit of Mercury. And only recently have astronomers been able to figure out why our solar system is the exception and how this actually explains the sun's incredible luminosity stability. And it's a recognition when they compared the sun with the most solar-like stars, it had a unique composition, very low in lithium abundance, and also low in what are called the refractory elements. A refractory element is an element that at room temperature wouldn't appear as a liquid or a gas.
Okay.
So it's basically a solid or a crystal. And what they're discovering is that the sun has a very low abundance relative to solar-like stars. But when we look at the planets orbiting the sun, they're very rich in refractory elements compared to what we see with planets that are orbiting other stars. And our planets are denser, which is kind of an enigma because the more distantly a rocky planet is from its host star, the cooler it will be. And therefore, you would expect that it would retain a lot more of the light material and not so much of the heavy material. But you see the exact opposite, that our rocky planets are denser than these hot Rockies that are orbiting their stars. And so the question is, how did that happen? And the answer is, well, early in the solar system's history, the sun transferred a huge amount of refractory elements and angular momentum to the newly forming rocky planets, which would explain why our rocky planets are orbiting so distantly from the sun and why they're so enriched in refractory elements, why the planets are so big. Because that's the other thing. If you add up the masses of all the rocky planets in our solar system, it's way beyond what we see in exoplanetary systems. And again, our solar system stands out like a sore thumb. We don't see other solar system or planetary system which has such a chemically unusual star with rocky planets that have these extraordinary characteristics. But that's exactly what you need to have for life. We wouldn't be here if we were on a warm, rocky planet, certainly not a hot, rocky planet. We need to be in a cool one, and we need to be orbiting on a big, rocky planet, not a small one, and a dense one that's super enriched with refractory elements. So it's all coming together.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the story of design to the core, how all these things actually come together.
Yeah. That's amazing. It's remarkable. I can remember when I started with Reasons to Believe, the work that you had done at that point, just identifying all the different design characteristics of the Earth and of our Earth-Moon system, and the relationship between the Earth to the Sun and our solar system, and it's just remarkable over the years to see how that list just continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. It's absolutely remarkable.
Well, it was fun for me, Fuzz. I got to give a few of the highlights of Design to the Core in a lecture I gave at Biola University just 2 days ago. And there was a gentleman in the audience who's an engineer in his early 50s, and he said, "This is the most exciting moment of my life, just seeing all these amazing discoveries and what it means for our Christian faith." And he was especially excited about all the new tools he had to share his faith. So, but yeah, the heavens are the work of your hands, one of my favorite passages in Hebrews 1:10. And this is the book, Designed to the Core. That's the cover.
I have not seen the cover yet. That's a really attractive cover.
I like the cover too. And of course, you can get the book at reasons.org donate. And you'll get the book about 6 weeks early. Well, thank you for joining us today on Stars, Cells, and God. I hope you found the conversation helpful and encouraging, both on topics relevant to the origin of life and the amazing solar system that we get to live on. Join the discussion in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, please share it with someone who may be interested in these topics. Remember to like this video and to subscribe for more content. New episodes of Stars, Cells, and God release each Thursday and are available for free here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Also be sure to follow us on social media at RTV_official to learn more about exciting projects that are in the works. Thank you, and once again, for watching. And remember, the more we know about science, the more we know about nature, the more reasons we have to believe in Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. Thank you.